Simon Smith chairs the steering committee of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. He retired in January 2022 from a 35-year career in the UK diplomatic service. He served in London, Tokyo, Moscow, Vienna as the UK governor of the IAEA, was the permanent representative to the UN in Vienna and HM Ambassador to Austria, in Kyiv as Her Majesty's Ambassador to Ukraine, and in Seoul as Her Majesty's Ambassador to South Korea. He has also served as Director, Russia, South Caucasus, and Central Asia at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and as head of Northeast Asia and Pacific departments of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Service. Simon, I know that is a massively condensed version of your extraordinary experience, but welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Brilliant. Is there anything you want to add onto that in terms of your role at Chatham House? Because you are one of the co-authors of this fantastic report, the link of which we're going to put into the video description.
Not much to add, just that it was probably about 2 years ago, so well before the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine, that I was asked whether I'd like to take over the chair of this steering committee, and I was told that it would be as much or as little as I wanted it to be. It might only be turning up 3 meetings a year or something. So the reality has been very different. It is a voluntary role, but it's one that obviously involves me in the work of Chatham House quite a lot, not simply chairing the committee when the time to call the steering committee together comes along. And so I've been very happy to, again, as I say, on a voluntary basis, to provide some thinking, write a few pieces, and obviously do a fair amount of work in the mainstream media. But I'm happy to say a fair amount of work talking to people outside of the mainstream media, as I am now presently doing.
Dare I say it, for those who are steeped in Russian history, politics, and current affairs, it's I wouldn't say it's a windfall, because that is completely the wrong word for it. But you find people are paying attention to what they're writing in a way that perhaps they weren't a decade or 2 decades ago. I mean, did you get that sense as well, that throughout this period you may have been sort of giving warnings or trying to explain the Russian mindset, explain maybe, and we'll come on to it later, maybe the imperial intent behind their foreign policy, but not really getting much traction?
In some ways, I was actually agreeably surprised. I mean, I came back from 4 years in South Korea, where obviously, having lived and worked for so long in both countries, my eye was never totally off Ukraine or Russia. But it was a very different environment, very different issues to carry on with. And I arrived back into this role, and obviously I arrived back in the UK about a month before the Russian invasion in February 2022. I had feared that there would be a lot more kind of two-sidesism in the British media than I found. Yes, of course, it was still there. But I thought, going into my first several media interviews after the invasion happened, I thought I was going to get a lot more of, well, look, we have to understand the Russian point of view here. And I thought I was going to get a lot more questions about, well, what about legitimate Russian security interest? And that's a phrase which clearly hasn't gone away. But I was agreeably surprised at how much progress I thought public understanding had actually made in the UK, that if you looked at Russia and Ukraine, and if you looked at what Russia was doing to Ukraine and in Ukraine, there was a lot more understanding that this was not an issue of there are two sides to this question, there are two communities in Ukraine, there are ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. I felt that before that, and even while I was in Ukraine and sort of explaining Ukraine and what was going on to my colleagues in London, I felt there was a little bit still of a hangover from Yugoslavia, and people thinking, gosh, this is a complex landscape of different ethnic communities with different backgrounds and different aspirations and different languages and so on and so on. I used to find it quite quite challenging, just to be explaining repeatedly that that was really not the way to see what was going on in Ukraine. So I rather expected that there would be a lot more of that kind of pushing heavy boulders to do in interface with the press when I arrived back in the UK. And in some ways, although a lot of that is still there, a lot of that explaining still needs to be done, I think that understanding has moved on a lot in those kind of 8 years between the, if you like, between the two Russian invasions of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022.
And that really talks, I think, to a sea change, doesn't it? Because Russian propaganda is all about exactly sowing that confusion, that inaction on the part of the West by suggesting things are much more complex. And that works. It still, I guess, works in some parts of the world, whether it's due to self-interest or so on. I mean, thinking particularly the African continent and the summit that was or the conference taking place in Russia this week, the so-called Global South, which I know is more complex than that because there are many leaders there condemning Russia, but propaganda really tries to foster that inaction by creating the impression that it's far more complex. There's a Russian phrase, "Это не однозначно," and of course that works so well with Russian audiences as well.
Yes, I wonder sometimes whether, particularly in Britain, there have been a series of kind of immunizations against Russian propaganda that sort of progressively did their work. Do I mean immunization or inoculation? I don't know quite which. But you know, I would among many other things, I would single out, in a sense, they're the obvious incidents: Litvinenko, Skripal, and MH17 as issues on which consumers, British consumers of media, would have had a very clear dose of the sort of absolutely wanton Russian effort to say, "Oh, you think the explanation for this incident is one thing, but you know we have one explanation, we have another one. If that won't do, we have another one, etc." And I think, having been through those episodes sort of progressively and intensively, I think that perhaps the British kind of readership and viewership was already at a point where it was saying, no, we're familiar with this. It's a situation in which the Russian machine will just start spewing out lies and kind of diversionary alternative versions of what's happened, and we're not falling for it.
Yes, and I think, you know, Ukraine has led the way, hasn't it, by pioneering various media literacy and conscious efforts to counter not just the narratives themselves, but the techniques. You know, the old thing about teaching someone to fish rather than just giving them fish, you give them the mechanisms. But Russia hasn't done any favors, has it? You mentioned there the brutality, through the sheer brutality of their actions and the brazenness of their lies. They have, since 2022, undermined their own propaganda in a way. Before that, it was far more effective when they were using the sort of hybrid warfare methodology.
Yeah, I think there's one other sort of really big gap in the kind of, if you like, this sort of Russian soft power or soft influence armory, and that is, I mean, I remember when I was heading up the sort of Russia team in the Foreign Office, we had a bit of a joke that went across the directorate to say, if anyone could come up with a plausible and authentic Russian language translation of the expression "charm offensive," they would be given a big prize. And you know, the point was that it just seemed to be an element that was almost entirely and consistently absent in Russia's engagement with other countries, with other parts of the world, engagement on issues. I could see this when I worked in multilateral diplomacy with Russian colleagues, even at a time when actually relations with Russia were not too bad. Most of my interface with Russian colleagues when I was Britain's governor on the board of the IAEA in Vienna were at a time, they were under the Medvedev presidency. They were at a time when relations with Russia weren't too bad in some respects. But even during that time, it was so difficult to persuade Russian colleagues to say, well, why don't you just kind of be nice to, I mean, we've got some people who are being a little bit difficult to our objectives. We actually at that time had quite a lot of sort of shared objective on where we wanted to get to on the nuclear deal with Iran. And yet we still couldn't persuade the Russians to say, look, there's room here for just a little bit of sort of oiliness and smarminess, and just sort of being nice to the people who we want to agree with us, who are being a little bit difficult at the moment. And the Russians couldn't do it. But of course, in much more serious contexts than that, I think that over the last 10 years, again, the world has got more hardened to this expectation that Russians just don't do soft power. They don't do charm offensives. They simply do threats and aggression and confrontation.
A sort of charmless offensive, I think you could term that. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the characters there, and before we get onto the sort of the big issues and the war currently, because I definitely want to get onto your role in the paper, but Medvedev is emblematic, isn't he, of someone who really existed in that hybrid period, someone who even now you can tell when you speak to certain politicians who had connection with him and his team in the period when he was president. A certain degree of disappointment in that they were labeling him, they were interpreting him using our own frameworks as a liberal, as one of us, as someone we could do business with. I might have always thought that was perhaps naive to an extent, but the kind of outbursts that you're seeing from him now, anti-Semitic, genocidal outbursts, completely unhinged. He's one of the more unhinged. He makes Solovyov sound almost sensible sometimes. This is symptomatic of the lurch that the entire elite who've decided to stay on in Russia have taken.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, although Medvedev is not sort of up close and personal, a terribly interesting guy to talk to. I mean, I haven't been in the same room as him since probably 2001, I should think. But going back to that period, and you mentioned the word liberal, and I think that we would certainly, in those days, working in the British Embassy in Moscow, and seeing a fair bit of the team around Putin that was giving him sort of the crafting economic policy, that we would definitely have associated him with those people, the people who are looking around at the Russian economy in particular, and saying there's things here we've got to fix, otherwise we're going to be in a hopeless mess. And although Medvedev wasn't certainly one of the movers and shakers of that team, he certainly came across as someone who was in line with the direction that they were taking, and was in line with the project that said Russia is not going to survive if we put all our bets on simply being a super petro state. And we bet our entire future on oil and gas. What actually happened, as we know, and seeing the extraordinary rise in the price of oil over that sort of roughly 2004 to 2007 period, is that the conclusion they reached was precisely that all you needed to bet on was the price of oil and gas. And so a lot of that sort of liberal, reform-minded, let's see if we can create a grown-up compassing. Medvedev has to make a start in sort of slightly redefining where he sits on these issues. But as you say, what's happened since then, and what has caused this sort of remarkable kind of flying off into one of the crazier orbits amongst what is a pretty crazy scene already, is a bit of a mystery to me.
You mentioned liberal economists, and actually Russia has got a number of world-class economists, and even though oil prices rose, they did make some changes in, say, tax and fiscal policy, which were generally lauded, certainly up until 2012. And many of those economists have actually stayed in place. It's been argued that without their role, the sanctions would have had a far greater impact. So what is the feeling there that you might have liberal economic practice or brains essentially supporting what could be described as a fascist imperialist regime?
Well, I mean, I think that it's not only in economic policy, but I think you're absolutely right. Maybe it's in economic policy where, in a sense, the sort of apparent contradiction is so apparent, it is so clear, that you have a number of people who I certainly would not. At the time that I was sort of talking to them in the kind of early 2000s, and these would still be people that would come over to London for discussions on fiscal policy, economic policy, and so on. So really, throughout the early 2000s up to the mid 2000s, we were still seeing people who were both influential and making earnest efforts to grow the Russian economy in sort of sustainable and ways that were compatible with the way the rest of the global economy worked. And I think that clearly what happens to a number of policymakers broader than economic policy is some kind of conflict, is some kind of choice that says you either remain loyal to your kind of principles, your kind of concepts to which you believe in as an economist or as a practitioner in foreign relations or whatever it is, or you remain loyal to what happens to be or appears to be the kind of political philosophy of your home country. And I could identify whole streams of people with whom I worked in the past in the Russian administration, who, on the one hand, I think surely they can't be buying into all this nonsense that the Russian propaganda machine is churning out. And I think on one level, I'm sure they aren't. On the other level, however, I can imagine the kind of pressure that they are under. I don't think that all of them have, in a sense, decided to act the way they do simply and straightforwardly as a matter of being sort of coerced or threatened into doing it. I think they have earnestly sought reasons as to how they can convince themselves that nonetheless Russia is on the right course and the rest of the world is on the wrong one. But it does increasingly remind me a little bit of the discussions I had with the first North Korean ambassador in London 20 or so years ago, when in his slightly less guarded moments, he would say things like, well, yeah, you've given me your standard message on how terrible human rights are in North Korea, and I must, of course, officially refute that and dispute it and so on. But the fact is that, yeah, sure, in our country, there are lots of people who have a hard life. I won't deny that. But the key thing is they know it's a necessary thing to put up with because they know the rest of the world is hostile towards North Korea, and it's the rationale why our life is tougher than yours is. And I just think that to some extent something similar has been going on in Russia. That the sort of Russophobia myth, I think, is a sort of starting point, if you like. But then the sort of message that, dear Russians, you are living in a world in which it's the rest of the world that has gone off into this monstrous orbit where it doesn't understand us. It doesn't appreciate the pressures that we're under. It doesn't recognize, again, our legitimate security concerns. And so, yes, of course, we agree that this is not perhaps what you had in mind when you graduated from the Faculty of Economics in University X and joined the government. But you agree, don't you, that it's now it's now a necessary hardship that you put up with? And I suspect a lot of Russian decision makers, policy makers, business people who one might well have put into the sort of reasonable and enlightened category several years ago, I suspect that some sort of a process of that kind has happened in their thinking, and that's why they are unreachable now.
And I think Timothy Schneider talks about it, doesn't he? It's a kind of preemptive accommodation with an autocratic regime. You
Yep.
may not entirely give your soul over to it, but you don't believe you personally can make a difference and change anything, and you don't necessarily have a set of principles you adhere to, which are, to put it mildly, red lines for you. So it becomes easy to get blurred into that world.
I think there's an extra element of almost of thinking that, oh, this is not going to last. This will blow over at some point. The pressures will be off. And again, I suspect that we've both read a lot of stuff sort of written in Austria and Germany in the 1930s saying it's too ridiculous.
It's never going to happen, of course.
It's awful. It won't last. And so, if there are aspects in which you kind of need to go along with it for the time being, fine, we'll do that.
That's it. And there was a particularly terribly written, but quite an interesting historical. It was the diary of a Muscovite or a princess, I think it was, assuring her English friends, I think in January 1917, that no revolution is possible in Russia. 70 years later, when everything that would have been familiar to her is swept away, it's that the fragility of that. And I won't mention the Brexit word, but I got a chilling echo when that was happening in 2016, and Trump as well. That people think that their societies, that their democracy, that their values are unbreakable and eternal. Until they're not.
Yeah.
Let's turn to your role in the paper, because I think you have got one of the most fascinating topics here, and the one which almost has the continuous pressure, not just from Russian propagandists and so-called, those who are a little bit more neutral on Russia, but actually you hear this all over being brought up as a serious topic, and that is that Ukraine should concede territory in exchange for peace. Now, I think everyone from Chatham House will argue vociferously in a variety of different ways as to why this is a fallacy. But this was your topic, and I'd very much like to hear you unpack why you think this is a terrible idea.
I think the starting place is that, generally speaking, if you're going to negotiate territory, then there needs to be a sort of genuine territorial dispute. And the boundaries of Ukraine are not in dispute. They were universally recognized in 1991. I would just observe in passing that, among other things, that recognition was also included in the basis on which Russia was acknowledged as a sort of successor member of the Security Council of the United Nations in succession to the Soviet Union. And there is kind of, as I say, universal acceptance in 1991. Those are the borders. There is no territorial issue in Ukraine. So I think that's the starting point. It doesn't make sense to look at this as a sort of territorial horse trading issue because there isn't a territorial dispute. I spent 2.5 years or so in one of the episodes that in my career in the Foreign Office that I didn't mention to you in advance, but I spent 2.5 years on the Cyprus problem. And I think to some extent, although I didn't explicitly draw in a kind of contrast with the Cyprus problem in my piece on Ukraine, in some ways that was sort of in the back of my mind that yes, it seemed to me at the time that it was absolutely natural that territory was an element in all those efforts when we were looking at how we might put together a sort of package that would be acceptable to both sides in the Cyprus question. I've just said both sides, and of course that's another huge difference, I think, between some disputes and the current issues in Ukraine. That again, there is no both sides issue. There is, to my mind, no conceptual basis on which the award of territory to the Russian Federation makes sense, or is fair, or is just. But anyway, that is sort of one set of issues. There is not even a sort of community. There is not even it doesn't even make sense in Ukraine to be talking about ethnic communities, to be talking about one community that would prefer to be Russian or another community that would prefer to be Ukrainian. That is not the case. And I think that the advocacy for a territorial element of a peace deal in Ukraine, I think some of that is driven by a fairly major misunderstanding of the whole sort of concept of what sort of ethnic Ukrainian or ethnic Russian means, a misunderstanding of the language issue. I'm still astonished when I speak to people who should know better, who think that if you are somebody who grew up speaking Russian in Ukraine, that must make you a sort of Russian Ukrainian or Russian-leaning Ukrainian. It's absurd. And I think one of the things that does need to be spelled out is that if you are thinking of a territorial element to a solution, to an end to the war that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine, you are almost certainly doing that on the basis of a misunderstanding and of a concept of Ukraine as having this notional, but in my view, totally imaginary. If anything, it's a creation of Russian propaganda, this sort of imaginary Russian community, which will be satisfied with awards of territory, satisfied with an invitation to say, go off and join the Russian Federation and good luck to you all. It's a nonsense. So as I see, one of the things I think I wanted to point out, I only had 800 words in which to do so, was just that this whole kind of starting premise is a fallacy. But there's the important second point about this is, even if you think, and I think, you know, there will be people who disagree. There'll be people who say, no, you're underplaying this. There is a Russian community in Ukraine. They do need taking seriously. And, you know, just as there is a Turkish-speaking community in Cyprus, you should be taking seriously the Russian-speaking community in Ukraine, or whatever it is. So there'll be people who object on those grounds. There'll be people who object on the sort of hard-nosed, ultra-pragmatic grounds, who'll say, yeah, we know it's terrible, we know it's unfair, and we know it's outrageous. It's an outrage against justice and reality and that kind of thing. But the thing here, the important thing here, is to stop the war. Because if we take what you're advocating we do, Mr. Smith, then this will go on forever. And tens of thousands of people that didn't need to die will die. And do you want that on your conscience, Mr. Smith, where you're arguing that we should not give away territory? So that's the ultra pragmatic view. And to answer that, I think that one almost has to get sort of pragmatic or realist in return and just say, what do you think is going to happen if you hand to Russia what is essentially a message that says, you have won, you have scored success in your efforts over the last 20 years or so, not only attached to Ukraine, but attached to other countries in the neighborhood, Moldova, Georgia, and so on. We will greet and officially give you a seal of approval for success in that policy of making your neighbors weaker, in a sense, rendering them failed states, because that suits your concept of security better than having strong and successful states in your neighborhood, and it allows you to grab slices of their territory. from which you can do what exactly? Grab more, perhaps? Well, we think very probably that's the case. And again, that I think brings us back to the final point, which is Crimea. And this is, I think, the part of this very short chapter that I wrote in the report, which I think, in one sense, gave me most difficulty. Not because I think that Crimea should be an exception, but because I am conscious that there are so many people out there in the landscape who do think that Crimea is different, and I think to some extent they are informed by looking at, in a sense, the status of Crimea really going back sort of way beyond the way behind the fall of the Soviet Union, and just saying, well, you know, who in the last 100 years has actually sort of cared very much about what happens to Crimea and about the people who live there, and so, you know, even I think there are people who would argue that even the sort of 1954 kind of transfer just showed that, well, all this is a bit sort of meaningless and it doesn't really matter which side it belongs to. I was conscious that there are many people, including a lot of people who understand Ukraine, who support Ukraine, who are outraged by Russian action in Ukraine. There are still amongst those people who say, yeah, but Crimea, come on, you know, it's always been Russian. To which I would answer, would you say, you surely wouldn't say, oh, come on, you know, India, it's always been British. It's as absurd as that statement, in my view. But once again, I think when one gets back to the question, which is not the sort of moral outrage question, it's the practical question. It's to say, what do you think Russians are going to do if you award them possession of Crimea as a great a prize for this outrageous war that they've launched on Ukraine? That isn't just a moral outrage. What next? You may think you're solving this problem. Actually, you're doing something which will hugely, in my view, increase the chances of Russia bringing this problem back to you again in greater measure. So you haven't solved a problem. You've done something which will mean it will come back and kick you very hard in quite possibly a rather short period of time.
And that's sort of what we're dealing with, I think, at the moment, isn't it? We're dealing with the inaction following 2014, the ambiguity with which that Russian aggression was met. Yes, there was some sort of superficial, kicking out of diplomats and this, that, and the other, but actually, you know, that would have been nothing more than just a sort of, you know, a gnat sting to Putin. He could sort of brush it off without a thought. And not only did that move not weaken his regime, it massively strengthened his popularity, both, you know, the invented popularity, but also the genuine popularity. And of course, we know Russians are lying behind a strongman. So the move in 2014 massively consolidated his regime, and it made the West look incredibly weak, vacillating, and so on, perhaps making this conflict inevitable. People perhaps are stuck in a mindset that this is as bad as it can get. I rather fear that we're at another 2014 moment, and at the moment we are arming Ukraine to survive, to hold its own, but not be victorious. If you agree with that assessment, what do you think is holding us back? What fears are holding back, in particular, the US administration from supplying more effective and more lethal capabilities?
I wonder whether it's not just a question of fears. But let's take fears first. I think to some extent, although I wouldn't overplay this, yes, of course, there is a little bit of fear about how far Putin will go if he's sort of totally forced into a corner and so on. Personally, I think that is something that we would be stupid to have our eyes closed to, but I think we're also unwise to be fearful of it. And I think we do probably need to ask ourselves every day, have we or have we not lost confidence in our own deterrence? Nuclear deterrence is a policy into which, whether we have liked this or not, successive governments have invested a great deal. I mean, not only a great deal of money, but a great deal of confidence. And I think that I still feel that it is the predominant posture which says, no, we haven't invested this effort and this finance for nothing. We believe in our own deterrence, and so there is a very substantial answer to the question: why does it make sense to dismiss some of the fears about Putin using nuclear weapons and so on? So fear, I think, is there to some extent. I think it's very natural. I think that many of the governments whose job it is to keep public opinion on side in terms of what they're investing in support of Ukraine, I think they're obliged to keep that question in front of them. They're obliged to keep in front of them the thought that just says, we actually want to win this war, or to help Ukraine win it, without unnecessary death and disaster and so on. And so we need to keep in mind that there is a sort of proportionality, and there is some kind of moderation, if you like, in the decisions we're making on what level of support is necessary. Again, I don't personally totally buy into that. I think I'm more attracted by the idea that just says, look, I think we need to wake up and understand that this is a war that we and Ukraine need to win. As I say, I'm not sure it's all about fear. I do think that another factor that's holding governments back is this. I mean, and in some ways, it is sort of a little bit similar to 2014. It's a kind of reluctance to understand that actually we're in a position that is very dire, and that sort of reacting incrementally is not going to work. But it's very difficult, I think, to change the sort of mindset which says, look, we don't want to smash up the landscape so sort of unrepairably that we're simply dealing with another kind of disaster after all this is finished. So let's just kind of, I don't even think it's saying let's just do it enough to keep Ukraine in the war and to keep Russia from being able to beat Ukraine. I think it's even amongst those who are saying, yes, of course, we accept the premise. I mean, Putin has told us that he's at war with us. So we don't need to worry about, in a sense, we don't need to worry about whether we're kind of a party to this conflict in that sense. But there is still this inhibition, which is, I think, as I say, is at the bottom of this inhibition is the belief that says, actually, it's about winning this war with the sort of minimum necessary effort. So let's be very incremental. Let's just sort of tease out, or let's just kind of eke out the support we give to Ukraine, and say that might be enough. That might just do it. I do think that approach, that mindset, is less significant now than it was. I feel there is more conviction that says, look, let's cut the nonsense about this. Let's cut the dithering. We understand now much better why this is a war that we and Ukraine have to win, and we should not really fear the consequences. And one or two of my colleagues have gone into this aspect in the Chatham House latest Chatham House report, basically addressing this question of why are there still so many people who around the kind of coalition of support for Ukraine who are still fearful of the consequences of a Russian defeat. And I think defining this very clearly and saying, no, actually a Russian defeat is by no means the least bad outcome from this. And in fact, a Russian defeat is probably better than any other outcome, which sees Putin still operating the switches in the Kremlin, and does not actually provide a really conclusive seeing off to this progressive Russian effort to smash up its neighbors and to render them failed states.
And of course, the propaganda makes good use of that. You know, it's like, you wouldn't want to see me when I'm angry kind of propaganda message. But in reality, Russia's been defeated plenty of times in its history through sheer, incompetence, strategic misjudgments, absolute lapse of equipment. You can go back and find many examples where Russia got an incredibly bloody nose and, didn't tear the world down. The two taboo areas, and I'm asking all the speakers in this series, there seem to be two taboo topics, however, which I think Chatham House speakers, are being a lot more adventurous than politicians, will go there. One is contemplating what the fragmentation of disintegration of Russia might look like. That's one taboo. The other one is if Russia was actually victorious. Now, I think it's looking far less likely, but if Russia actually won in Ukraine, it's my belief that we need to imagine that in great detail to spur our conviction that Ukraine must win, imagining what the consequences would be, not just for Ukraine, but Eastern Europe, Western Europe, of a Russian victory. I don't think that's a useful mental exercise to go through.
Yes, and I think some of the best people actually to in a sense, to paint in the detail on that part of the picture are people from some of those countries that will be kind of in the headlights and in the headlines if Russia wins. And I know there's a danger of if you put a typical, say, Latvian-speaking member of parliament or something up to advocate why it's not a good idea to let Russia win, then you will carry perhaps a little bit of a risk of getting a very sort of rabid and a view which perhaps is less convincing than what might look like a sort of dispassionate view of it. But I think that there are a lot of very level-headed, grounded people, not only, let's say, in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, in Moldova, in some of the Eastern European countries. I think you could look in various of the Central European countries who, even if you listen to parliamentarians in those countries themselves, even members of the governments in those countries themselves, they are deeply concerned about whether they will be next in one sense in Russia's progressive effort to weaken the structures of the European Union, to weaken structures in member states of the European Union. So I think that clearly you're not going to find this in the Hungarian government at the moment, but I think you will find it amongst a lot of very concerned Hungarians. I think you'll find a lot of very concerned Slovaks who are looking at the vulnerability of, again, the immediate sort of Central European neighborhood. I think that there are a lot of very plausible and, I think, as I say, very level-headed advocates for the case that says, don't let Russia win, because we are not scaremongering when we say that our countries are very likely to come next. So I think that's one, I think, very useful place to look for, in a sense, the convincing case as to why letting Russia win is a really bad idea.
And of course, Ukrainians, I mean, I have a certain point of view on this, which perhaps people won't be surprised at on the channel. It's my belief that Russian citizens will continue to lead shockingly bad and miserable lives as long as their country clings to its imperial fantasies. For me, the only long-term solution is the disintegration of the last empire in Europe. But that is a step, and most Ukrainians, I think, would wholeheartedly go along with that. And as you say, they'd be seen as emotional and perhaps a little irrational. But that's another area, whether it's intentional or accidental disintegration of Russia. Putin and some of his acolytes have actually mentioned it. Now, that may be as a way of fostering action in the West to say, don't push us too hard because you wouldn't like the consequences. But certainly, I have spoken to someone who has spoken extensively to Russian diplomats and to people in Putin's circle. And he said their number one fear over the last 20 years has been the disintegration. I think they are quite mindful of the fragility of the multinational empire that they are dependent on to extract, their wealth, status, and influence.
Yeah, and I think they only have themselves to blame and to some extent, this comes back to what we were talking about a bit earlier about the charm offensive. Even when I was working in Russia and visiting a lot of the sort of further flung so-called subjects of the Russian Federation, the sort of messages you would hear there were the guys in Moscow they don't give two hoots about our livelihoods here. They're interested in us only because of the resources they can extract from us. And, frankly, the idea that here in, let's say, Bashkortostan, that we're really interested in setting up a great sort of independent Bashkortostan, come on, it's nonsense. But because we are misunderstood in Moscow, because there is no policy that actually aims to enhance the integration of Russia, that aims to create a Russia where, in a sense, some degree of decentralization and devolution can be respected, but where, in a sense, the resource of Russia is kind of fairly allocated. Then, as long as a concept like that is absent, then nothing is really going to work. Now, I still don't think. I mean, I don't sense that there is a massively kind of centrifugal force in Russia that will lie at the bottom of some enormous kind of cataclysmic disintegration of Russia in the future. But it does rely on an administration in Moscow that actually has got its head screwed on about how devolution works, about how decentralization, about, when you say autonomy, what do you mean? And on the whole, it would be better if you did mean what you say when you said autonomy, and so on. And again, none of those concepts have been anywhere near, as far as I can see, have been anywhere near the front of the minds of Russia policymakers for years and years. So, in a sense, the people who are sitting around in Moscow, anxious of the prospects of fragmentation of the Russian Federation, I think to an extent they're operating on the basis of their own misplaced assumptions, their own lack of knowledge about the way in which Russian regions work. Yes, there are some extreme cases, and I think it's all too easy to. I remember this even from the sort of early 2000s. It's all too easy to convince a Russian administrator in Moscow that because the situation in Chechnya was so awful, that's the kind of thing that you'll see all over Russia. And again, it's nonsense. It simply isn't going to happen. But it happens in the minds of those people who have been administering or have been the administrators of Russia for the last 15 to 20 years. And it's not surprising because they misunderstand the situation.
And paranoia, dare I say it, goes hand in hand with the KGB. And it's that sort of class of people who's running the show. And I imagine the Kremlin, that giant ancient fortress, imbues people after a number of years with a heightened sense of paranoia. We could probably talk on this topic for many hours, Simon. I think we've probably come to the end of that. I think we covered that topic exceptionally well, of why surrendering territory is morally, politically, and in every sense, the wrong thing to do. And I want to say thank you for the report, for the work you do, and of course for your time today.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.